Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings films have had a mixed legacy. While the original Lord of the Rings trilogy has been acclaimed as some of the best films ever made, The Hobbit has had less positive reception. Now, there are many reasons why people might dislike the Hobbit trilogy, such as the fact that it's a trilogy, but I'm not here to criticize the film. I'm just here for the archery. Not gonna lie, Lord of the Rings has some pretty crazy archery tropes, especially any scene involving Legolas. But most of these things can be easily brushed off as, oh, it's a movie, it's fantasy. But there's something which stuck out to me in the Hobbit movies, which I can't for the life of me explain, and it's the baffling case of Bard the Bowman. In the opening scene of the third movie, The Battle of Five Armies, we see Bard make his stand against Smaug the dragon. Unable to pierce the dragon's skin, hope is lost until his son Bane brings up the last black arrow, the only weapon capable of bringing down the dragon. Bard creates a makeshift ballista using his broken bow, the tower's frame, and his son, and brings down Smaug with a direct hit in the only exposed area of his scales. As awesome and cinematic as this scene was, how does that even work? As a proper Tolkien fan, I have to refer back to the source material. So, in the Hobbit book, Bard is basically a regular guy. He's part of the militia of Lake Town, who happens to be a descendant of Girion, the Lord of Dale, which we do see in the movie as well. Now, Bard uses a regular bow, and the black arrow is a regular arrow with black feathers. It's a family heirloom, and according to the backstory, it's an arrow which never misses its mark. It's always retained by the user. So, according to the text, the black arrow has no magical properties. It's simply an arrow of last resort used by a highly skilled bowman. So when the dragon attacks Lake Town in the book, the thrush which flew from the Lonely Mountain tells Bard of the dragon's weakness, and Bard, having only the black arrow left, uses it to shoot down the dragon in its weak spot. As with many things, the movie takes a lot of creative liberties with Bard's story arc to make him a more significant character. It introduces the Wind Lance, which is a dwarvish ballista weapon or siege weapon mounted around Lake Town and Dale. We see this very early on in the second movie where Thorin sees it and makes reference to it, and we do see a flashback of Girion using it to fight the dragon. The black arrows are the ballista bolts for the Wind Lance, and basically Girion launches dozens of black arrows against the dragon to no effect. The one major plot point is that one of the arrows did strike true and dislodge the scale that would be the weak spot for Smaug later on. I actually rather like this interpretation. It makes more sense to bring down a large dragon with a siege weapon. So using the Wind Lance, which has a pretty cool name, to shoot black arrows, which are ballista bolts, is pretty sensible. I mean, if it takes one regular arrow to bring down the mighty Smaug, he's not so mighty. So yeah, Wind Lance, ballista, black arrow, I get it, it makes sense, I can get behind that. Except Bard doesn't use the Wind Lance. In the second movie, we are introduced to Bard, and with part of his character arc is that he does hide the last remaining black arrow as a descendant of Girion. And he actually does attempt to use the Wind Lance when the dragon attacks, and then is arrested, so he has to hide the Wind Lance, which is later recovered by his son Bane. Now, when we get to the beginning of the third movie, we see him do his last stand. And let's dissect this sequence of events. Firstly, as a side note, as a commentary on his technique, it's kind of unorthodox. It's an inverted two-finger grip. It's not very common in archery. It can be done, and notably, we have seen speed shooters use this technique. But yeah, it's not a very common one. It's not wrong, but rather unorthodox. But what we can see is that Bard is using a standard issue bow from the armory. He's shooting accurately at a moving target, though unable to penetrate the dragon scales. Smaug taunts him, Bard realizes he's in a world of hurt, and then Bane brings up the black arrow. Now let's pause here. What exactly is Bard planning to do with the black arrow? Remember, the black arrow is purposefully designed to be shot from the wind lance. He doesn't have a wind lance. So Bard picks up his bow and finds it's broken. Wait, hang on. What was he planning to do with the bow? Was he seriously going to try to shoot the black arrow, an oversized ballista bolt from a longbow? Let's educate ourselves a bit here. So a ballista bolt is not simply an oversized arrow. It's a man-sized projectile that can be launched at high speeds from a very powerful siege engine. And again, it's not an oversized arrow. There's actually no physical way to knock a ballista bolt onto a bowstring and shoot it from a handheld bow. It's like if you had an artillery shell and you were thinking of using it from your rifle. Now, even if Bard could somehow get the arrow onto his bowstring, he can't shoot it. It's just far too heavy to project from a bow. We can establish that it's a heavy projectile because it's very clearly designed to be an armor-piercing weapon. A projectile penetrates when it can transfer enough energy through a single point of impact. A heavier projectile transfers more energy. To launch a heavy projectile, you need a very heavy launcher, such as a ballista or a wind lance. And historically, ballistas were made to have thousands of pounds of force. Again, these were heavily made siege engines. Now, a warbow at best might draw 150 pounds, assuming that Bard is even using a warbow. Even with that, simply put, if you try to shoot the black arrow from a bow, it's going to drop about a meter in front of him. There's simply not enough energy from the bow to launch the black arrow. This is, again, taking your artillery shell, somehow putting it into your rifle, but using the same amount of propellant as your rifle cartridge. This doesn't matter because he can't use the bow, it's broken. So he MacGyvers a solution by jamming the broken limbs into the tower structure. Wait, how does this even make sense? Firstly, how does he have the strength to jam the bow so deep into the tower frame that it doesn't break or pop out? And remember, this is a burning structure. It's weakened through smoke and flame, and somehow he lodges it in by hand that it won't splinter when he pulls it back. Secondly, the length of this new weapon is much longer than his original bow. So how did he manage to get the string from his bow to work with this ballista? And again, from a physics point of view, you can't transfer that much energy from a thin string. Something this thin as a bowstring can't push a heavy projectile. To push a heavy projectile, you need a much heavier string. And for a ballista, these were very thick cables. Now, I've read in some explanations that it's the rope from the bell tower. I don't know, I didn't see the rope from the bell there, and somehow he makes it into a bowstring. I don't know. It doesn't make any sense. You can't put a bowstring onto two broken tips a meter apart and then somehow stretch it back several meters. And you can clearly see in the scene that there's so much slack. Something of this amount of energy needs to have so much tension, it can't be held by hand. And yet this elastic band that's being stretched over his son's shoulders is somehow capable of being so efficient that it can bring down a dragon. And thirdly, even if all these things were done right and the string was correct, it's still not physically plausible. The potential energy in the bow hasn't changed. He's still using the same bow limbs that he had with the longbow when it wasn't broken. So by jamming it into a wooden structure and pulling it back further, he doesn't magically add thousands of pounds of force somehow. Again, the energy from a bow shot comes from the limbs flexing. By pulling it back, it puts the limbs under tension, and by letting it go, it transfers that potential energy into kinetic energy. If I take these limbs and put them onto something else, it's still the same set of limbs. This amount of potential energy hasn't changed. If I try to launch a black arrow from this, whether it's from this bow or split up and attached to two different towers, it's still going to flop a meter in front of me. If even that, with that amount of weight in the projectile, it might not even get the arrow off Bane's shoulder. As in, quite literally, if Bart lets go, the black arrow stays there because the weight of the projectile is greater than the weight of the string trying to push it forward. Anyway, the rest of the scene is just ridiculous as it is epic, so we'll leave it there. He does the shot, brings down Smaug the dragon, and brings about the rest of the movie. In conclusion, I get that it's a fantasy film, and therefore a lot of incredible things are allowed to happen. But even in universe, things need to make some kind of sense. And this is where I think the writers really got carried away with how they think bolts or arrows work, and none of this makes any sense in the context of the Lord of the Rings. If it was some kind of magical mithril bow that could be much stronger and more efficient, then sure, that makes sense. But it's a wooden stick that somehow has the strength and technology of a dwarvish siege weapon. It doesn't work that way. And for me, when I watched the movie the first time, I liked the setting, but I couldn't get my head around what he was doing. And if this bothers you as well, then you're the only one. This doesn't make any sense from an archery or from a siege or physics perspective. What I think would have been better if Bard was allowed to find a wind lance in the movie. Like there might be one more wind lance and there's like burning towers in the way, and he has to fight his way through the flame and smoke to reach the wind lance, and somehow Bane comes and has to save his father to let him climb the tower and shoot the wind lance. That makes a lot more sense because that's the throwback to the flashback with his ancestor. You know, because the same actor plays both Girion in the flashback and Bard, and they both use the wind lance, that will be such an epic cinematic storytelling device. And yet this wind lance that we see at the second movie is never brought back and used again. And instead what we get is this weird MacGyver tower that can kill a dragon. Anyway, that's my little rant. The point isn't to criticize the whole movie. Again, other people do that in much more detail. I'm just here for the archery. You thought that was kind of weird, then yeah, I fully agree with you. I can't make sense of it in any way. Doesn't detract from the movie, but it's one of those weird observations. I'm sure there are many other weird ones in Lord of the Rings. But what do you think? Are there any other things you want me to mention from the Lord of the Rings trilogy or the Hobbit trilogy? Let me know your thoughts below. This is NUSensei. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.